Okay, good morning. Today's lecture or discussion is creatively entitled Radical Egalitarianism Continued. We're gonna have to start getting better at coming up with these. Let me try and turn this down. We're getting a little, I apologize, we're getting a little feedback from somewhere in the building on the mic. It could very well be my the myriad numbers of cell phones that everyone here has, including myself. So one of the things I want to do today is talk about radical egalitarianism a little bit in relationship to other trends. We'll sort of build this, seeing as how this is the first one that we're dealing with. We'll build this analysis, and then also what I want to do is pull out some lines and have a kind of dialogue with you guys about some of the specific primary texts that you read, such as the Frederick Douglass, the W.E.B. Du Bois, and some of the King text that you guys read. So relative to other trends, radical egalitarianism has been the most institutionally powerful. If we think about institutions like the NAACP, somewhat less so the Urban League, that's a whole other set of conversations. A series of other sets of institutions. I have to forget that these things are recorded. Like the Urban League people will be coming after me on YouTube. He's just in the Urban League. Organizations like Jesse Jackson's Operation Push, a range of them have all had a kind of radical egalitarian. The only trend that has had at least an equal or sometimes even more powerful institutional focus has been Black nationalism, with organizations like Marcus Garvey's UNIA, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. But Marcus Garvey's UNIA was the largest Black mass organization ever in the United States of America. But we can think about organizations like the NAACP, the SCLC, and though currently they are not as institutionally powerful as they once were, radical egalitarians and their organizations have had their places. They've also, along with Marxists, had strong places and placement in things like trade unions, et cetera. In fact, much of the early civil rights movement was supported, or in particular, not the early civil rights movement, but the sort of parts at the end, a lot of those marches included union activity. If we think about, we're later on going to talk about Martin Luther King's last speech. He was in Memphis in support of striking sanitation workers, and was interacting with the sanitation union at the time. And so there was a connection between civil rights organizations, unions, particularly organized labor, is another way to put it, as well as organizations like Jewish groups and others that were organized in a set of overlapping organizations, as well as churches, et cetera. It's radical egalitarianism along with nationalism. It's probably one of the more compatible with U.S. ideology class I pointed out, from the libertarian strand of U.S. ideology out and extends them in a way that libertarians would find anathema. And it's also kind of critical of not necessarily the sort of ideals of the U.S., but in particular kind of the practice of those ideals. So, in as much as we're going to look at some of the texts today, I think there's an interesting point to point out that are used by radical egalitarians. One is just as I just mentioned, the use of the language of equality, right? The concept, the language of equality, the sort of theme out of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are frequently repeated and dispersed within speeches, within texts, And they use the kind of seminal founding text, the Bill of Rights, the preamble to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. It is connected again to an activist tradition, right, that seeks to agitate and sees activism and agitation for freedom as an essential part of perfecting or making democracy work. Democracy isn't sort of passively activated, but is made manifest through the activities of regular people who express themselves in the public square. And one of the ways in which radical egalitarians formulate a kind of critique of the sort of practice of American democracy or the practice of American governments is through the use of intertextuality. One could call intertextuality some of the similar themes that might be a little more familiar to describe this concept would be riffing or sampling. So the interesting part is, so if you think about it, so give me a sample or a riff from we listened to the "I Have a Dream" speech. What was the kind of sample that Martin Luther King pulled out in that speech? Right. It used to be self-evident that all men are created equal. He pulls that out of the Declaration of Independence and places it in a context. It's the same thing as a sample. It's a kind of riff. "Let Freedom Ring," another riff, from the song. He actually quotes "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty of thee." And it's interestingly enough that both what this does in the context of sort of radical egalitarian speak is it takes these quote unquote sacred texts, right, of the founding fathers that supposedly everyone agrees with and everyone has a connection to, and it takes those texts and it recasts them into an argument for African American humanity, African American equality, et cetera. And it is a kind of rhetorical strategy. That rhetorical strategy is also layered in terms of some of the kind of call and response themes of African American culture, as well as the kind of and those themes appear in all kinds of things. Like if you think about the use of sampling in rap music, right? The pulling of some text. I think, for instance, like if you think about Public Enemy's "Nation of Millions," there's a beginning where I think they're citing, I think it's Louis Farrakhan, and so they pull a Louis Farrakhan speech, sample it into the song. The sampling of other songs. Jazz musicians frequently took Tin Pan Alley, very familiar Tin Pan Alley tunes, and reworked them and reworked the themes into entirely new and different songs. So this is a tradition of taking something that people are very familiar with and bending it to one's own purposes. And that's a kind of familiar theme in African American culture and rhetoric, music, letters. If one thinks about the literature of Toni Morrison, how she takes themes directly from, in particular, the New and Old Testament, and bends them into stories about the sort of the conditions of African American peoples at different times in American history. Yikes. So one of the things is that use of the kind of clever use of thematics in that way that you see in sampling in rap music or the quotation in jazz music. I remember one time there's someone challenged Charlie Parker to play "Pop Goes the Weasel" in every single song that he played in a whole set. Yeah.
I was just wondering, did you check the battery on the headset? That might be what's cutting it out.
It's not is it the battery? No.
I had another class in here, and the microphone did the same thing to that professor, entire point.
Right. So, sorry. I don't know if I could do without it. Like if I could just shout, which I'm perfectly capable of doing. Yeah, say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud, right? See, that's riffing, sampling. So these kinds of things. So for instance, like if you go back, like there was one historically there was one set, and someone challenged Charlie Parker to play "Pop Goes the Weasel" in every single song in every single set, and frequently that also comes out of some of the improvisational nature of African American culture, right? These kind of riffing patterns and the use of samples, and can you work something in that wasn't previously there? I remember it was one of the more hilarious moments during the current election. We'll see it later. There was Barack Obama was giving a speech, and he was talking about how the Republicans were going to try and communicate to working class whites, and he started going, "You've been hoodwinked, you've been bamboozled," and where does he get that one from? It's Malcolm X. So it's Malcolm X, but the line was one of the premier lines in the Spike Lee version of the film Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is going, and so the line keeps going, "You've been hoodwinked, you've been bamboozled, you didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on you." And it was just funny because he's using it in his speech, and he's laughing while he's doing it, because a lot of people aren't, probably a lot of his audience in Western Kentucky or wherever he was, isn't getting that he's dropping Malcolm X on them, and he's doing it. Another one he did was when during some of the sort of conflicts with Hillary Clinton, when he quoted Jay-Z. I just brushed my shoulder. I go and brush my shoulder off. So these are kind of these are things that actually in the African American, both sort of rhetorical and artistic tradition, become really sort of interesting ways in which one makes references to other things and layers references. And we'll see this again and again, and it's a kind of wordplay, which is can I talk to working class whites in Western Kentucky and use I don't know exactly where he was. I think he was actually in Virginia. But can I use Malcolm X, right, to motivate them, without them even really knowing it? Like the people who know, if you're in on it, he's using Malcolm X. If you're not in on it, then you think about other kinds of things. And then sometimes the messages are coded. Other times the messages are supposed to be, obvious. The reference is supposed to be recognized by the audience. And in that prominent moment that starts the second half of the "I Have a Dream" speech, where Martin Luther King goes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," that marks the beginning where he's going to go into the kind of poetic phase of the speech rather than the beginning critique. He's going to make that transition. So we're going to see a lot of this in some of the texts that we're going to think and talk about. So first I want to talk about the Douglas speech, 4th of July, kind of how he talk about some of the themes, how he begins, what is his challenge to the 4th of July, some of the concepts. Let me do this. Let me pull up Has everyone been able to find the readings okay? In terms of what was placed online, what's in the reader, et cetera, et cetera. Has everyone been fine with being able to I guess that's not a problem. Let me see. I'm trying to find a page where Douglas begins. Oration in Corinthian Hall. So where is Douglas when he gives this speech? What's the context? What's going on when he steps up to the mic? I guess there probably wasn't a mic at the time. Where is Douglas? Where is it? What's the occasion? What's he doing? What's going on? Help me out here. The speech is called Oration Delivered in Corinthian Hall, Rochester, July 5th, 1852. So where is he? Set the scene for me. Give me, aside from that, set the scene for me, somebody. Who's in the audience? He even makes a reference to it. The president's in the audience, right? So he's speaking at a celebration that's connected to July 4th. The president is in the audience. He says, right, the first line, Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens. And so how does he start the speech? What does he start the speech by doing? How would you characterize the sort of opening, the kind of opening of the speech? He says, he who would address this audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before an assembly more shrinkingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. What is he doing there? He's stating he's nervous, right? That I'm gonna have some difficulty here. A feeling has crept over me quite unfavorable to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. Yeah. Right. Well, what's he going to do after that? He's going to blow him out of the water, right? So he's setting it up like, oh, I'm just a former slave. I'm going to come here and I don't even really know if I can speak. I'm not even sure if I can do it. And then he's going to set it off, right, in a minute, right? And he knows that, right? He knows this, and so it's a device, right? It's a device, which is there's a demand of him to have a certain kind of humility, and so he's playing with his audience. He's bringing them in, okay, so that they're becoming sympathetic to him in a certain kind of way. He even says things like, and Frederick Douglass was known as one of the sort of great speakers in history and of the abolitionist movement. He goes, the little experience I've had in addressing public meetings and country schoolhouses avails me nothing on the present occasion. Right, I'm not ready for this. This is me stepping into the big leagues. What am I going to do? The papers and placards say that I'm to deliver a 4th July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way for me. It is true that I've often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence, but neither their familiar faces nor the perfect gauge I think I have of Corinthians Hall seems to free me from embarrassment. So he's embarrassed to speak there. He's he's bringing his audience in. Like you're going to be sympathetic to me because you can't be mad at a speaker who starts off saying like, I'm really sorry. I'm very embarrassed to be here. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm gonna try and engage with you. Then he turns on him in 1 second, and he says the very next paragraph is, the facts is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable. And the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude. You will not therefore be surprised if in what I have to say I invest no elaborate preparation, nor grace my speech with any high-sounding exordium. With little experience and with less learning, I've been able to throw my thoughts hastily and imperfectly together, and trusting to your patient and generous indulgence, I will proceed to lay them before you. So he's continually lowering expectations, but he's slowly beginning to say, okay, I'm going to talk about slavery. I'm going to talk about slavery. I'm going to let you guys know, I'm going to let you have it about the sort of problem of American slavery. And so in the very next, I'm trying to get this to cooperate for me. No. Okay, let me shrink and then move it over. That's good. So then he goes and says, this, for the purpose of celebration, is the 4th of July. So, but it's actually the 5th, but for the purpose of the celebration, it's the 4th. It is the birthday of your national independence and your political freedom, right? The audience might not have noticed that, right, at the point, but he's developing a line here, right? He's not saying our, he's not saying the political freedom of the United States or political freedom in general. He is naming that the freedom envisaged by the moment or by the 4th of July is limited, right, to the whites in the audience. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God, right, referencing the Old Testament and the exodus of the Jews out of Egypt. It carries your minds back to the day and the act of your great deliverance, and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act and that day. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I'm glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. So notice that sentence, I am glad, fellow citizens, right? So he recognizes himself as a citizen, but he places himself outside of it, right? I'm glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. It's kind of a very sort of, again, a kind of curious formulation, right? That he's developing, that he's subtly developing here, perhaps not so subtly. 80 years and 10 is the allotted time for individual men, but nations number their years by thousands. According to this fact, you are even now only in the beginning of your national character, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. The eye of the reformer is met with angry flashes, pretending disastrous times, but his heart may well beat lighter at the thought that America is young and that she is still in the impressible stage of her existence. May he not hope that high lessons of wisdom, justice, and of truth will yet get direction to her destiny. Were the nation older, the patriot's heart might be sadder. And so he places that critic, right, as the true patriot. The reformer is the patriot, right? Not the person who's just celebrating the 4th of July. The patriot is the reformer, not the person on the outside, on the inside, actually. So he goes on, talks about America. Talks about your sovereign people. He talks about, how horrible England was and getting rid of the king. Of course, that's all well-worn stuff. Everybody feels good about that. Oops, I went too far. And then he turns to specifically, I scarcely need to say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Such a declaration of agreement on my part would not be worthy much to anybody. It would certainly prove nothing as to what part I might have taken had I lived during the great controversy of 1776. To say now that America was right and England wrong is exceedingly easy. Everybody can say it. The dastard, not less than the noble brave, can flippantly descant of the tyranny of England towards the American colonies. It is fashionable to do so, but there was a time when to pronounce against England and in favor of the cause of the colonies tried men's souls. Then they who did so were counted in their day plotters of mischief, agitators, and rebels, dangerous men. So what is he trying to do with this setup? Yeah. Oh. Right, so he's trying to create a parallel between, he's trying to say, look, the founding fathers were perceived to be radicals, crazy men, and now everyone sort of celebrates them. And I'm probably going to tell you some things that are really uncomfortable, and you might say the same things about me, but look, I am occupying that same space. So he goes on. He goes, oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men, and if they did not go mad, they became restive under this treatment. They felt themselves victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there's always a remedy for oppression. Just here the idea of total separation of colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, much more so than as this distance of time regard. So then he goes specifically and says, on the 2nd of July, 1776, the old Continental Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and the worshipers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution, and as we seldom hit upon resolutions drawn up in our day, whose transparency is all equal to this, it may refresh your minds and help my story if I read it. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. Citizens, your fathers made that resolution. They succeeded. Today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you therefore may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring bolt in the change of your yet undeveloped destiny. Pride, patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompts you to celebrate, to hold it in the perpetual remembrance. I've said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the change of your nation's destiny. So indeed I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, at whatever cost. From the round top of your ship state dark threatening clouds, may we see heavy billows, the mountains, the distance, blah, blah, blah. And he keeps developing this kind of concept of the chain. And in fact, and why is he developing a theme of a chain? What does the chain begin to represent? Slavery, right? So in some ways he's talking about freedom, but he's going to turn that into a discussion of slavery. The whole scene, population of the country. Let's jump ahead. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in the respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation state at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I'm compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They are statesmen, patriots, heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They love their country better than their own private interests, and thought this is not the highest form of human excellence, all which concede that is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited. So he talks about what wonderful people they are. He goes on, we have to fully appreciate them. We need to understand. Great. We have to keep going. And he keeps going on about how we need to be enthusiastic. So he goes, then he starts to turn. So he's brought you in. We can all feel good. And he goes, friends and citizens, I need not enter further into causes which lead to this anniversary. Many of you understand them better than I do. You can instruct me in regards to them. That is a branch of knowledge in which you feel perhaps a much deeper interest than your speaker. The cause which led to separation of colonies from British Crown have never lacked for a tongue. They have all been taught in your common schools, narrated at your firesides, unfolded from your pulpits, and thundered from your legislative halls, and are as familiar to you as household words. They form the staple of your national poetry and eloquence. I remember also that as a people, Americans are remarkably familiar with all facts, which make them in their own favor, right? So here's a critique, right? Americans only like facts, which exalt and suggest that the project is good. This is esteemed by some as a national trait, perhaps a national weakness. It is a fact that whatever makes for the wealth or for the reputation of Americans and can be had cheap will be found by Americans. I shall not be charged with slandering Americans if I say I think the American side of my question may be safely left in American hands. I leave, therefore, the great deeds. So then he turns to the present. My business, if I ever have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is ever living now. And I think one of the critical themes in radical egalitarianism is the idea that the concepts of freedom are kind of living concepts, right? That the notion and evolving concepts and notions of freedom, right? So that the notion of freedom expressed by the founding fathers, while it was sort of broad in its principle and application, we should clearly never stop there, right? Freedom must constantly be expanded and thought about in new and different ways. And so then he goes on to cite some poetry. Your fathers have lived and died. Men seldom eulogize. And then he goes, and then this is when he actually kind of turns on his audience, right? And he goes, fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to speak. Why am I called upon to speak here today? So he's then going to bring in the elephant in the room, right? So you've asked me to come here to speak, and I've been polite with you now. And my assumption is that you expect me to come here and give you a really nice, polite speech about, how wonderful the 4th of July is. America's wonderful. But could you please free the slaves? But that's not what he does. He goes, what have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Right, so he's saying, I wish I could say that's true. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delighted. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so obdurate and dead to claims of gratitude that would not thankfully acknowledge such priceless benefits? Who so stolen and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs? Right? So he's saying, like, look, I'd be a bad guy if I didn't acknowledge if we had freedom of a nation's jubilee when the chains of servitude had been torn from his limbs. I am not that man. In case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak and the lame man leap as an hart. But such is not the state of the case. I say with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. So your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessing in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlit light that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. So this is the moment where he turns the speech to challenge his audience. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean citizens to mock me by asking me to speak today? So he's saying, what's wrong with you people, right? How dare you invite me here to talk about the 4th of July and celebrate freedom and independence and to tell you something to make you feel good about yourselves, if that's what you think you want me to do, because you want me to absolve you of your sins, right? And I started real nice, I brought you in, but that's not what you're gonna get here. You're gonna get, and in some ways, right, this is the challenging and activist tradition of radical egalitarianism, right? It's not passive, even though folks like Martin Luther King advocated nonviolent resistance. It is an activist tradition that in many ways tries to sort of, dramatize the sort of issues of equality. And he goes, so do you mean citizens to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. And let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes towering up to heaven were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty, burying the nation in irrevocable ruin. I can today take up the plaintive lament of a peeled and woe-smitten people. And then he quotes, I think it's the Song of Psalms, by the rivers of Babylon where we sat down, yea, we wept when we were remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they who wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Fellow citizens, above your tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions. And so what he does is he, from then on, he takes the kind of notions of freedom and the speech and the kind of context, and he turns it against the very people who he's speaking to. And then he digs directly into the question of slavery. I want to go to one more thing. He starts to talk about specifically abolition, anti-slavery. He even gives some specific examples. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. So goes on. I want to find one more quote for you that I think is a useful one to set up some of the other traditions. Then he goes, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty and unholy license, your greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty, heartless. Your denunciations, oops, I just messed up. So he takes, I'm having a hard time working with this PDF. I should have just printed out the text. It would be much easier. So much for the electronic way of doing things. So what he really wants to say is he really wants to challenge even the notion of the 4th of July and its meaning. And then I'm trying to find a particular part. And then he uses one theme that I want to pick up because we'll talk about it again with Du Bois, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages, right? And he says that that's actually what's being done. The actual celebration of, so he poses that the celebration of the 4th of July and his even being invited there is a way to cover up the crimes of savages, right? The crimes of the nation, that there's an attempt to hide them. And he starts to talk about the fugitive slave law. Talks about the church. I'll find the quote in another text because it'll be easier. And so then, he does a sort of basic denunciation of the issue of slavery. And then, just to sort of give you a particular quote, it's one of my favorites from Frederick Douglass. He lays out what I consider to be the predicate of radical egalitarian activism. He says, the whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being putting all tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thundering and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its waters. The struggle may be a moral one or it may be a physical one, and it may be moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. And I'm sure you guys might have heard this before. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did. It never will. And so he's also at the same time suggesting that if you want to challenge my activist sense, my challenging sense, both from the discussion of the development of American democracy, which comes out of a violent revolution, and my suggestion of this is that in the event of human history, that democracy is never advanced by doing nothing, right? That an activist tradition and a challenging of it. And so you can't tell me to go slow, to wait, to not agitate so much, to not be a rock in the shoe, that if you want any progress, it has to be painful. It has to have agitation. It must have those kinds of things. And that exactly as he says, and he calls it what it is, which is that in particular, he names that the nature of politics or the nature of these conflicts is about power. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. So he names the political and what must be done. Politics is the authoritative, allocation of values. It's about power. It's about the exchange of power and the use of power. And Douglass Douglas is aware of the political nature, not just that, he says, look, it may be a moral struggle, it may be a physical one, but ultimately when he invokes power, he invokes it as a political struggle, right? That this is the domain of politics and the domain of power. At least in my estimation, I think that is one of the great American speeches, both for its style as well as its substance. I mean, to think about that Frederick Douglass, this is the equivalent of throwing shoes at the president, right? For his day. The idea that he would say these things in the presence of the president, someone like Douglass, who is himself not, only a few years out of slavery himself, has most African Americans are enslaved. He's standing there in front of the president and he's telling them off. He's telling him off. He's telling America off. And he's doing it in a way he doesn't have personal security. There's nothing that says entirely that the crowd wouldn't have run out of there and lynched him when it was over. And said, how dare you? I mean, the incredible amount of courage for him to go there alone. He has no protection. He doesn't even have the protection of the rule of law. They could say, well, thank you. You so hate the institution so much. You dislike America so much. Let's chain you right back up and send you back down south. I mean, that was a legitimate. He's talking about the Fugitive Slave Act. Douglass is a fugitive slave. He's a person who's fled slavery. He's still officially owned by someone else, or at least their estate. He could be returned to their property. And so the idea of the individual act of courage of him not only to in some ways, right, to use the phrase, to speak truth to power, and do so at potential sacrifice to himself, without fear, and in this sort of courageous way. The kind of courage of the speech is remarkable and quite amazing. I mean, if someone were to get up today and say, if someone in the immigrant rights movement were to get up today and say, on the 4th of July and say, this is your 4th of July, not ours. We don't have rights. This is how you treat us. How would that be received? What would happen? Yeah, they'd start going, send them to TJ. Like, let's there would be a huge uproar. Or if following 9/11, right, when they were rounding up Muslim Americans, if people had spoke out in that way. Yeah. So someone else has a comment.
I think Obama does kind of use the same.
Yeah. He does it all the time.
Yeah, he uses his humility, and then, we all know he's very intelligent, but he humbly does it so that it will seem even more powerful,
Right.
I think so. In a couple of the speeches, the one about race, the one about fathers, I feel as if he humbled himself. He always brings in his background, his experience, and then he goes into, well, here's the problem, and this is how we can solve it. But it's always in a very, I don't want to say passive tone, but I feel like it's
Will you bring your audience in? Your audience, you pull the audience onto your plane. You develop a sympathetic relationship with your audience. Yeah.
And I think also, well, at least with Obama, he develops like a non-confrontational tone, especially he doesn't. One of the big debates about his for blacks is, you know, like.
Right. Goddamn America.
So,
I didn't say that. Jeremiah Wright did.
yeah, so they have to, I think he tries to develop like a non-confrontational, like, no, like, you know, I'm not against you.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit about that, which is, I mean, one of the fascinating, and we'll end on Obama kind of, but one of the things you guys are going to witness the inauguration on Tuesday, and one of the things I would look out for is the way he will use some of these same themes. The themes of the founding fathers, the themes of the notions of freedom, the themes of the sort of great achievements of America. And what he's going to do is, and this is what he does consistently in a series of speeches, he's going to recast them. He's going to recast them in a way that, that then, so if we think about, I'll do this briefly just to sort of say, Frederick Douglass appears in one of Obama's most famous speeches, the Yes We Can speech that will.i.am does. And there's a point where he talks about, and basically in that speech and in the part that's covered in the song, Barack Obama refounds the nation. He constructs a refounding of the nation, and it's in some ways a little ahistorical, but it's sort of in its poetic ability, it's actually stunning, because what he does is he starts with the founding fathers, right? And then the theme written into the founding documents, right, ends up being "Si se puede," right? Where's "Si se puede" or "Yes we can" in the Constitution? No, but but he kind of claims it as an ethos, right? So this is an ethos of challenging and a kind of march to a kind of greater freedom. Then he turns to so it was a theme of the founding fathers, but it's also, who else does he talk about? Who does he pivot to next? I know you guys have heard this thing 100 times. Who does he pivot to next? Slaves and abolitionists, right? So there's Frederick Douglass, right? So Frederick Douglass then becomes, even not necessarily even in his in the sort of invoking of him specifically, but as being the sort of person, a slave, abolitionist. Frederick Douglass becomes a founding father in that speech, right? That the struggle to perfect American democracy and end slavery is a part of the realization of the founding of America. And so abolitionists, women who reach for the ballot, people who sought to unionize, right, laborers, a president who chose the moon as his new frontier. So there's John Kennedy is another part of a founding of a kind of great America. And then who does he end with? A king who took us to the mountaintop, right? So then Martin Luther King himself. So bookended by Douglass and King, there's a refounding of America that weaves these quote unquote kinds of oppositional struggles, not as struggles against America, but struggles to perfect America. And then in that sense, right, one's patriotism causes one not to reject that tradition, right, but to embrace it, right? So love of America is to love the agitation of abolition. Love of America is to love the women fighting for the right to vote. Love of America is to love the struggle for unionization. Love of America is to love Martin Luther King. That's a profound way of thinking about those traditions rather than thinking of them as dissident traditions, right? In conflict with the basic principles of American ideals, which is the flip side of that, right? So the Sarah Palin version of it is that these are people who see America as imperfect, who want to destroy it, who want to mock it, not those who are sort of keeping the principles sacred themselves. That's the sort of principal conflict that's at play, and it's been one for a long time between those kinds of principles. And in that rhetoric, you saw it much more clearly. Those two versions of a kind of a sense of American patriotism. One, a radical principles, because it's clear that you were not to be included in them, right? It wasn't meant for you, right? The Constitution was not meant for black people. The Declaration of Independence, it didn't mean that all men were created equal. It meant that all white men were created equal. And so there's always a kind of tension. And in some ways, again, with Du Bois, it manifests itself. You know, Du Bois called for the elevation of a group of talented people to develop not only a sort of way to challenge being a part of American civilization, but also to develop African-American art and letters. He called on racial uplift. But later on, particularly in World War I, Du Bois called on African-Americans to close ranks behind the war effort and to set aside their special grievances. With the idea of this is that African-Americans would be able to achieve citizenship by joining in that struggle in World War I. By supporting the war effort, they would earn their citizenship. Well, so it didn't work out that way, right? The period after World War I had some of the worst race riots that the nation has ever seen. And when World War II rolls around, Du Bois is like, I'm not with that. I'm moving towards the Communist Party. We'll talk about that later. And then he ends up, Du Bois, the sort of great, purveyor of radical egalitarianism, ends up dying living in Africa, in Ghana. He's targeted by McCarthyism. He doesn't see himself as being a part of it. He doesn't see the American project as being capable of being rehabilitated after what he's seen over the course of his life. And this parallels the careers of a lot of other radical egalitarians. You also have, just to mention, I think there's prominent women in this particular trend, in particular Ida B. Wells or Ida Wells Barnett. She's a journalist, an activist. She wrote for the Chicago Defender. And her journalism largely focused on investigating lynchings. And she went out and publicized the kind of inhumanity of them and wrote about the problem of lynching and its relationship to democracy. But one of the things is that she frequently in her journalistic endeavors debunked the myths about lynchings, right? That the guy was lynched because he'd raped a white woman, or because he, committed some crime. And she frequently found out the guy was lynched because he went and tried to vote. The guy was lynched because he was running a successful business that was developing certain kinds of resources. The guy was lynched because he was becoming a community leader, and people were beginning to agitate. And she exposed, lynching as an act of not of sort of dealing with black crime, but as acts of political violence, political terrorism, designed to prevent black people from exercising their political and social rights. And there's a number of black women who have figured, sort of very prominently in radical egalitarian discourse and movements in the organizations, particularly in the civil rights organizations. And we'll talk about this when we talk about black feminism. Women like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and others were the central people who did all the on-the-ground organizing. They did all the behind-the-scenes work such that Martin Luther King could stand, and A. Philip Randolph and the others could stand at that podium at the March on Washington and look really good and say really eloquent words. But the reason why all those people were out there was because of the women who did the training, who did the organizing around the marches, who even crafted a lot of the strategy in terms of getting people together. We can turn a little bit now to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. Who's the target audience for the letter that he writes? Yeah.
Clergymen that wrote a letter to him, kind of distancing themselves from him.
Right. And what are they kind of distancing themselves about? What's there?
Just his methods, how he approaches things. They kind of consider him un-American.
Right. So they consider him un-American, right? You're un-American. You're going too fast. But are they saying that they're against him?
Not so much.
Right. So they're saying we support you. Just go slow. Right? You're agitating too much. You're losing people to your cause. You're pushing too fast. They're running right up against, and Letter from a Birmingham Jail again kind of reflects what goes on in the Frederick Douglass quote, right? That one must agitate. King lays out in Letter from Birmingham Jail the principles of nonviolent resistance. And nonviolence, and I sort of urge you to look really, really critically at and long at both the letter, but as well as, if you ever have a chance, the other writings that King writes on both the sort of philosophy and principles of nonviolence, as well as its sort of application, because it is a deep philosophical position that then has a series of strategies and tactics meant to dramatize that philosophical position. The idea that you are defeating injustice, not people, right, is a sort of application. King, even in other contexts, says, I don't necessarily like boycotts. I only find a boycott moral if the sort of end goal is to put justice into the sort of set of business transactions. I don't engage in a boycott to put somebody out of business as a form of punishment or retribution. That's not the aims and goals of a boycott itself. And even at some point in another interview says, if that were the aim of a boycott, it would be immoral. And we've actually recently we've seen people, not sort of people in general, but there's been in the LA Times, there's been the sort of interesting case of the opposition to Prop 8 after it passed. There's a sort of restaurant in West Hollywood, and the manager of the restaurant had given $100 to the yes on Prop 8. And so they launched a boycott of the restaurant, and basically sort of, this woman who gave this $100 basically being put out of business. And right, if you actually understood, and so the way the stories end up getting written is about this sort of sympathetic woman who's being, targeted and sort of punished for having given $100. And so if they had sort of thought, right, before employing this tactic, if they'd sort of thought about Martin Luther King's principles, they probably wouldn't have used that boycott against that particular restaurant. Because, well, what would you have? So, for instance, the Montgomery bus boycott was to have the bus company lift the restrictions on, requiring black people to sit on the back of the bus, et cetera. Well, what would you have the restaurant do, right? Gay and lesbian people can eat there. Is the lady supposed to repudiate her support for Prop 8? Well, she could. I think she has. She said, okay, it was a big mistake. Well, the boycott's still in place, right? And so the point is that in some ways, it doesn't, every single, in the principles of nonviolence, it's not just that you engage in marches and tactics, you only engage in them in as much as they advance or help to dramatize some specific goal that advances the cause of justice that you're operating. And so King develops those sort of principles in the letter, articulates them elsewhere, but he's challenging white liberals and white liberal members of the clergy. And he's making a moral challenge. He's saying, this is a moral outrage, and you should act on a moral outrage. So there's a number of sets of things that radical egalitarians articulate, and I want to bring it the use of freedom, the sort of broad interpretation of government and other activism to bring about freedom, the idea of coalitions, right? That you would reach out to, in particular, sort of white liberals. A kind of unifying message is a critical part, right? King wants to, King and others, Du Bois, et cetera, want to kind of perfect. What was the title of Barack Obama's race speech? You cited it, Corey. What was the title of it? It was a more perfect union, right?
Was that sort of, I feel as if, because I know Jesse Jackson wrote a book about that, and I don't know, I just wonder if it's sort of, it correlates or if it's somehow tied together, because I know that they sort of.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, it's also a riff on the preamble to the Constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice to ensure, you know, so the idea, a more perfect union, perfecting the union by creating better understanding based upon race. I'm gonna move this over this way. And so in many ways, you see both these sets of riffs, the kind of development of the activist style, the tradition of nonviolence that comes out of radical egalitarianism, the focus on freedom, the focus on activism. And in order to kind of close out, I don't leave you guys, you read it, but its performance is even more stunning, which is both in its sort of prophetic nature, which is sort of Martin Luther King's final speech. That he gives the day before he's assassinated. And we'll sort of end class on that, and we'll pick up doing some analysis from there. So that was, that final phrase was Martin Luther King's last utterance. He was assassinated the very next day, standing on a balcony in a hotel in Memphis. And as you observed the events, both in terms of, you know, listen for some of the themes from those speeches, egalitarian themes, but also one of the things that will be interesting is if the president elect in his inaugural uses that cadence, right, the call and response cadence from this by his sneeze. You know, he develops a rhythm that builds in the speech and builds the sort of emotional content of the speech that he used. And, you know, what was it? Was yes we can, and he sort of build a riff and then end it yes we can, and so we'll see if he uses some of that both that strategy and things that come out of the African American vernacular. So I'll see you guys Thursday. Take care.